As an industry, we all know that advice is valuable. From holistic advice to single topic, once off or ongoing, or anything in between, the value in advice is significantly more than the cost is to a consumer. However, not everyone buys it, be it because of the lack of trust in the industry, particularly post the Royal Commission, the inability to pay up front for advice, or the perception that it's only for high net wealth individuals. Not everyone gets it. And that creates an advice gap, which gives us an inflection point in advice. Before we get to that, let's understand the advice gap. On the left-hand side here, the bars on the left show the demand for advice. With a growing population and growing wealth, we're seeing demand grow by about 60,000 households a year. On the right-hand side, though, is supply. We all know about falling advisor numbers, which is going to create a decrease in the supply of advice, and that will create a gap of about 1.2 million households by 2030. Of course, for those who provide advice, this is a great story, an ability to increase prices and profitability. However, for the rest of the industry, it's not so good. It creates a public policy issue. Obviously, for the individuals concerned who don't get advice won't be as well off. And for us in the industry, a smaller contestable pool makes it harder for us to win. However, tinkering just won't work. We've known about this pending advice gap for some time, and so far the changes we've made have looked to improve the length or reduce the length of an SOA slightly, improve advisor efficiency a little bit. But what you can see here is you need some dramatic changes in order to really be able to tackle this advice gap. And that creates our inflection point. How do we approach and deal with this advice gap? We think there are two main ways. First of all, the regulatory change. There's no doubt Australia's been winning in regulatory overreach in the last few years, but there's some signs that might be starting to change, and we might be ready for a slight loosening cycle of the advice regulations. We believe there's the opportunity for a pre-approved framework that allows advice on a scaled down and simplified range of strategic areas and a simplified product set. This is quite consistent with what we've seen from government and regulators already in relation to My Super and the impending My Retirement. And as a result, we would call this My Advice. My Advice would be advice in relation to a much smaller set of areas on a limited product set. It would be dashboard-like around, are you taking the right kind of actions for someone in your scenario, and how are you going relative to people in your cohort? That simplified framework would come with a simplified compliance regime as well that would allow the efficiency that advisors need to be able to provide advice to a lot more people than what currently they can serve. We think there's also a second option as well, and that is in relation to targeted advice. A second option to be able to deal with this inflection point is a targeted advice model. We know there are people who go through very similar stages of life. We know the problems that they have, we know the solutions that they need. And those homogenous needs means that we can deliver a targeted advice model to them and solve those needs in an efficient way. Of course, people with more complex needs will need to be triaged out of this process, but for the rest, we can deliver a really efficient way to provide advice with a targeted model. One of the benefits here is the role tech can play. Advisor tech can already solve most homogenous needs and the limited variations between individuals who fit this targeted advice model. Of course, it's not just tech that we need to be able to solve this. To be able to really address the advice gap, this needs to be a widespread solution, and that means it needs to be provided by a big brand. Unfortunately, so far, we've yet to see any incumbent advice provider really step up to the mark here. And so that means we're probably in the domain of either someone else in the value chain wanting to enter advice, or someone outside the industry looking to come in and seeing the opportunity for a new advice model. So where does all that leave us? Unfortunately, unless we make some significant changes, advice is probably going to remain in the domain for the high net wealth, be an industry where we focus on the haves already. But there are options to be able to make regulatory change and to address a targeted, more efficient advice model that can help us solve that advice gap. So where does that leave us? Well, unfortunately, traditional advice that we know it is probably going to remain the domain for the high net wealth and be focused on the haves. But there are two opportunities. The first is that reg change to be able to provide a much simplified advice model, and also an opportunity for a provider to be brave and put in a very segmented and targeted advice model. And all three of them can help us work together to solve and address this inflection point and how we solve the advice gap.